It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are working and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people who inhabited the land along the Mohicannock, known today as the Hudson River, and called themselves the people of the waters that are never still. To the Mohican and other native communities before the arrival of Europeans, farming, hunting, and fishing were their means of survival, so they developed and utilized the environment while keeping in mind the need to preserve it. Having endured awful hardships during forced removal from their homelands, today they reside in Wisconsin and are referred to as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. And now, with joy, we can celebrate the return of 156 acres of ancestral land to the Stockbridge-Munsee community in 2021. The Papsacani Island Nature Preserve, named for a sachem of the Mohican people, was returned to the tribe by the Open Space Institute and offers public access to over 2 miles of Hudson River shoreline. As proclaimed by Shannon Holsey, the Stockbridge-Munsee community president, the Mohican Nation thanks Open Space Institute for this exciting opportunity to reestablish a connection to an important cultural site in its ancestral territory. Today, we pay honor and respect to their ancestors as we commit to building a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable space for all. We recommend visiting Pachaquatch or Cleared Meadows in Valatia, which was a meeting place and settlement of the Mohican people, appearing on maps as early as 1686. To learn more about Mohican history, follow the Long Journey Home story walk crafted by the Mohicans and the Institute to celebrate the restoration of Papsacani to the community, which can be accessed at, then we have a link. Lastly, we can honor the indigenous people of this land by creating and maintaining land conservation practices, much like the Mohicans have done in the past and continue to do in the present day. Please get to know the indigenous people of this area and ask what you can do to lift and raise their voices, to honor them, and to respect their sovereignty. And then we have addendums, which I'm thinking is what Meg sent to you to put up. That is all.
Great. Well, really well done. Thank you so much.
Really
Right
beautiful.
then.
Yeah.
Thank you, Melissa. Okay, well, welcome everyone to our grant session. I'm excited to introduce Kristen Wilson, who's with us today. She is with REPCO, a Kingston-based nonprofit which works toward creating strong, vibrant, and inclusive communities with a home and opportunity for everyone. Kristen joined REPCO in 2021 as the Assistant Vice President for Community Development, and she brings extensive experience cultivating partnerships for community health, developing projects, planning street transportation, managing infrastructure, municipal infrastructure grants and projects, and writing grant proposals. Prior to joining REPCO, Kristen worked as Director of Grants Management for the City of Kingston and as Senior Resource Educator for the Healthy Communities Program of Cornell Cooperative Extension of Ulster County. So you are in good hands with her. And you all know that the DEC offers CSC grants, as do other entities which municipalities can apply for. And we know municipalities don't necessarily have the financial means to undertake climate projects, small and large. So today's session is all about getting the lowdown from Kristen on how you can navigate the process for applying for grants, and then the often overlooked workload of managing them. So please take it away, Kristen. Welcome. I think you're on mute, Kristen. Okay.
Okay, there we go. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Great. I'm just going to expand my view here so that I can see all of you. Excellent. So everybody can see my screen and hear me. Great. So I'm going to dive into my presentation, and I don't actually know how many of you have ever written a grant before. Actually, if you have written a grant before, would you raise your hand? Okay, so many of you have written grants before. And so I'm sort of starting from scratch here. So some of this might be a little bit of a repeat for those of you who have written grants before. But I wanted to give a good overview of how to get started. So when I got involved with grant writing, I really had no intention of being a grant writer. It was not what I wanted to do. It was not my passion. And what I wanted to do was do projects and make things happen in my community. And so that's sort of how I ended up getting involved in grant writing. So I resisted grant writing in the beginning because it's hard. It takes a lot of time. You might stay up late writing grants, those sorts of things. But now I've sort of adapted to thinking about a grant as an adventure. And so I sort of make this relationship to thinking like I'm going out to plan an expedition. I just watched a movie at the Woodstock Film Festival called Exposure about a group of women who were from Europe and the Middle East, and they went on an expedition to the North Pole. In fact, it was potentially the last expedition to the North Pole because of the melting of the polar ice cap. And I think they did that in 2019. Anyway, it was a very inspiring movie, and so when they were planning this expedition, they really the expedition planner figured out like where do we want to go? Obviously the North Pole, and who do we want to be with, or who do I want to be before I go on this adventure? It's really important to spend time doing that. And the reason that I have that on the top is that a lot of times what happens, and it happened to me, and I've seen it happen over and over again, is that grant opportunities come into your email, or people have an idea and say, hey, we want you to apply for that grant. And so folks get into a reactive way of applying for grants, like they see an opportunity and then, okay, like let's pull it together, let's do it, when they haven't really had a chance to think about what is the project that they want to accomplish. And it's very easy to get derailed and kind of get off of your path of what you'd like to accomplish, because suddenly you get busy writing something else or doing something else. So I just stress that it's good to spend some time there. And then obviously, if you're planning an expedition, you got to get out all the maps, you got to figure out where you're going. You've got to do a lot of research. Same thing with grants. So you'll be identifying grants, and I'll show a slide of areas where you can find more information about potential grants. Then you go out on your expedition, then you've got to plan all the details of your expedition. So you make your route, you tell your story of how you're going to get there. You might have to ask funders to help fund your expedition. It's the same thing with when you're applying for the grant. You're basically, when you're grant writing, you're telling the story and you're trying to inspire the person that will fund you to give you money for your project. And then finally, once you have the grant, then you've got to go on your adventure. And during that adventure, you'll be making lots of adjustments. If you're on an expedition, you'd be sending letters back home. I think of those as the reports to the funder. And then you obviously need to monitor your spending. So that's just a bit of an analogy to think about grants. Hopefully that might be a bit helpful. So as I mentioned, long before you go on your grant adventure, you want to research. I have a tool that I will share with all of you. It's a concept paper. And so it's just something that before you even start looking for grants, you can put together this concept paper and really map out what is the project that you would like to accomplish. for many grants that you may apply for, you may need more than a concept paper. Especially, I'll get into a little bit about the CFAs, which is the consolidated funding application that many municipalities can apply for. And so for many of those grant opportunities, you may need to have a planning study, whether it's your comprehensive plan, or it may be an engineering technical study that you need to have in advance of applying for the grant. And sometimes you may need to apply for a grant to get that study done, so then you can apply for the big grant. So basically you may need a planning study or an engineering design or whatever it is to then be able to apply for the capital funding for your project. So project development can be as simple as a concept paper or as complicated as a comprehensive plan or full engineering study. So this is what I will share with you. I'll send this, or Paige or Vanessa will send it to all of you. And it's something that we used at the City of Kingston to get a grasp on grants that or projects that we'd like to accomplish. So identifying grants, one of the ways, you can spend hours and hours and hours researching grants. I found that the ways that I found out about grants most frequently at the City of Kingston was either I would get a tip from the mayor or from somebody else that a grant opportunity was about to come out. But also you can subscribe to the Grants Gateway, and they send out notifications for grant opportunities that are coming out. That's the New York State Grants Gateway, or professional newsletters. So if you're interested in walking and bicycling, joining, there's all sorts of advocacy organizations that will share about potential upcoming grant opportunities. And then professional organizations. So if you are interested in micro hydro, then you probably want to find some professional organizations or engineering organizations that are working in that area and join them or get on their newsletters, because you just never know what's going to pop up. And my feeling is that if you've done your homework with the project development and you know what you want to do, like the universe will, I know this may sound a little cheesy, but the universe will bring you the grant opportunity that you're, whether it comes in your email or on your Facebook or on your LinkedIn or whatever, it'll come to you if you know what you want to do. The Foundation Center Online is a service that you can pay for. I have utilized it before. It's good if you're looking primarily for private funding and not government funding. I found it difficult to learn how to use. So I didn't use it that much. But if you are looking into finding foundations or private donors to fund your project, it could be a good place to start. So there's, I would say, 6 types of funding that you could seek. There's local government funding. So for example, at the City of Kingston, we had sometimes funding that our Common Council would set aside for projects that we could apply for, or that the community could apply for. There's state funding, and I'll talk a lot about the New York State CFAs in a few minutes. There's federal government funding, foundations or private donors, private companies. So sometimes like Lowe's or other large corporations will have grants. And then advocacy and professional organizations. So one time when I was working at Cornell Cooperative Extension, we got a grant through the American Planning Association to work on public health. And For me, that was sort of an unpredictable source of funding, like a professional organization, but that it is a potential area where you can find funding. Just some tips when you're applying. So now you've identified a grant opportunity. Obviously, you want to sign into the grantor website. I always download, and if there's a grant application process, I download the application guidelines and I read through them very carefully in the beginning and highlight the things. And then you want to use your concept paper, and I have another tool that I'll share with you. It's a grant application decision matrix, and you may want to use that with your other municipality leaders to decide, okay, whether do we want to apply for this grant or not. It's very easy to get kind of lured by a grant opportunity. So I think it's worth taking some time, like this grant application decision matrix kind of helps you decide, is this the right grant for us to apply for at this point in time with the capacity and the people that we have to manage the grant once we get it. So those are some tips for applying. When I'm applying, I always start with a budget. So another thing when applying for a grant is that people will sometimes see the opportunity and their imaginative juices get flowing, right? So they're like, wow, we're going to apply for everything under the sun, and very, very excited about all the things they may be able to do with the funding that's available. And then reality strikes when you start putting the budget together. So I always start with the budget, like how much do we have and how much do we need? Obviously I'm thinking about what we're trying to do, but I start there because that way folks don't get disappointed when they realize, oh, okay, we can only do 20% of this big grandiose project that I really would love to do. Another thing, you need to have authorization to apply from your town or village board. That's something that sometimes gets skipped over. A lot of times the grant, especially state grant funding sources, will require that you have a resolution from your town board to apply. And if you don't time that properly, you can miss a grant opportunity, depending on when your town board or village board meetings are taking place. So a lot of times you'll need to gather data. So, I may find myself on the census website or other websites gathering data about my community. A lot of times that will already exist in your pre-planning, your comprehensive plan, or your other plans that you have done for your project. Collaborating with partners, that kind of goes along with getting the letters of support. So if you're and this I think sometimes is underestimated as well, like how much of work it takes to communicate about your project to partners in your community. Sometimes you might have competitors or people have a different idea, especially if you're a municipality. Lots of people may have different ideas about what you should be spending your time applying for. They may not like your projects. So sometimes that can take some extra time that you weren't really planning for when you're writing your grant. And usually it's under a kind of a high stress environment because there's a deadline and you need to communicate and write what you're doing at the same time. And then obviously I mentioned before, really grant writing is about telling a story and telling a compelling story. So a lot of times I'm writing a grant in my head for days or weeks before I ever get to paper. And I'm thinking about like, why would this be inspiring? Why should this project happen in my community? I always plan to complete my grant application a day before the submission deadline. I'm sure many of you have experienced, technical difficulties or it's just something happens on the day of that you're supposed to submit it. So I'm just thinking, the last, it wasn't a grant, but it was like a response to the county a request for an expression of interest. And I had to get it onto a thumb drive, and I'm relatively new at RUPCO, and I had to deliver this thumb drive to the county, and we were finishing up at the deadline, and because of our cybersecurity policy, I couldn't get the grant onto the thumb drive, and so it was just this like last minute, so those kinds of things that you don't anticipate happen often when there's a deadline.
That sounds like a very stressful day, Kristen.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was just like I had to get in touch with the administrator, and that we figured it out. But it's just those sorts of things you have to plan ahead for. Here I'm just sharing with you a budget that I don't know if it's very clear to see, but and I'm happy to share this with you as a sample budget for this is for a project at Dietz Stadium. It was a construction project, so it's a capital grant application. So I'm just sort of showing that we have a total project cost, a grant amount, and a match amount. I'm going to talk about matches in a minute. So that's something that I always put together when I'm doing the budget, is making sure that I've figured out what will be the grant funding that I'm asking for and the match funding that the municipality will supply for the project. So getting into grant matches, many grants will require that the municipality provide a match. And there are many different ways that you can provide match. You can provide cash or in-kind services. So that might be staff time being spent on the project, or volunteer time being spent on the project. And so sometimes it's challenging to figure out the match. And when you're reading your grant application guidelines, you really want to pay attention to that detail. So I once applied for a grant for the city of Kingston and didn't pay attention to a detail and lost out on an opportunity for $600,000 grant through the DEC because I didn't pay attention to one detail about the match funding. We applied the following year and then we got it, but it's just like you spend a lot of time. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to those details. So sometimes the grant requires, the language will be it's 20% of the project cost. And sometimes they'll say that the match is 20% of the grant amount. So that's a little, if it's the project cost, that's pretty straightforward, right? It's just if you have $1 million project, it's 20%. The municipality has to provide $200,000 worth of either cash or in-kind services. And the grant you'll be awarded $800,000. If it's a local match that's 20% of the grant amount, then you've got to do some little like mathematics and sort of some gymnastics. So I had a little formula that I would just plug into Excel that I'm showing on the screen here. And I would just play with the numbers if I knew that my project was going to cost $1 million and I wanted to figure out exactly how much am I applying for and how much do I have to provide as match, then I would just play with that. So I'll share this with you. If you ever have questions about that, I can certainly help you with the math. Another thing that is confusing to even some of the state agencies that I've worked with is like whether your match funding, so you can use other grants to match other grants. And so the funding doesn't have to come only from the municipality for match. It can come from another grant that you have for the same project. Several of the projects that I worked on in Kingston, and specifically the Broadway Streetscape project, it was a $9 million project, and we had 4 different funding sources. So we had grants matching other grants, and it got kind of confusing, as we advanced through the project. So this is just a table that shows you federal. So if your source of funding for your grant is a federal source, you can't match it with another federal source. It has to be matched by a state source or a local source or foundation. This shows you, essentially, if your source is coming from the same government level, they can't match each other. But federal grants can match state grants, and but then sometimes you have to be careful, because sometimes a state grant, like for example, there was one that we got through the Environmental Facilities Corporation, and I thought it was a state funding source, but it had a little bit of EPA money mixed into it from a federal source. And so then later I found out that my grant couldn't be matched by a federal grant that I was hoping to match it with. So these are kind of really dry details, but when you're applying for a grant, you want to think about how you'll meet the match. So you've submitted your grant application. Now you've won the grant. Now what? Managing grants can be really challenging. We applied for a lot of grants all at one time in the city of Kingston, and then we didn't expect to get them all. We just really wanted to do a lot of great things in the community, and then we got a lot of the grants that we applied for, and then we were sort of like, oh my God, how do we manage this? And the city is still struggling with that. They unfortunately, the Common Council approved hiring many new project managers to help manage the funding that we got, but it is a challenge. So the first thing you want to do is you'll get a resolution passed by your town or village accepting the grant and authorizing the mayor or whoever your executive is to execute all of the documents. And then you have to identify a project manager. Hopefully you've actually done this before. I'll take questions in a minute. Hopefully you've done this before when you were doing your grant decision matrix and you were doing your application. You want to know who's going to be managing the project. There's lots of designations that when you're collecting your data and developing your proposal, there's potential environmental justice areas. There's New York State opportunity zones. And if you Google these things, and you can generally find maps of these online to find out whether your community is in these zones or not. And those designations may make it easier for your municipality to receive a grant. So I think Kingston, at the time that I was there, now Kingston's population is changing a little, but it was, we were more competitive for grant funding because we were a disadvantaged community. We also receive CDBG funds because of our income levels in Kingston. So I think we were probably much more competitive than like a Westchester County town or municipality, but it still did not allow us to not provide the match. We still had to provide match to many of the grants, almost all the grants. I know that many of your municipalities, because they're small, might not have a system to manage grants. So especially if you're a volunteer and you're taking on managing the grant yourself, you're going to want to find out like how your municipality organizes their files and their finances. When I arrived at the city of Kingston, we did not have a good system for managing grants, and it's still a little bit of a struggle. So this is a sample folder that is sort of a cradle to grave system of managing all the documents for a grant that we put together. And you can create something like that from this PowerPoint. So just some other things to think about when it comes to managing a project. So we talked a little bit about finances. There's that aspect of managing a project, but there's also procuring vendors. So there's state procurement law, and you probably have a local procurement policy that you have to follow. And sometimes that can be, initially when I got to the city, I was like, wow, this is a lot of work just to like hire somebody to do something. But over time, I actually became very convinced by our procurement policy because it gives you an opportunity. There's a couple of different things you may have to do. You may have to do a request for proposals, or a request for quotes, or a request for bids. So request for quotes is usually for a lower cost item, like $10,000 or less. A request for proposals would be for like your engineering design firm, and that is more involved process. You send out the request for proposals, you get formal responses. A request for bids is for a construction project. So those are all things that this project manager may need to do. And then once you get your consultants or your vendors on board, you've got to oversee them. There's often a lot of work to secure permits and approvals for the project. You may need to go through a seeker review, and you may need to conduct public outreach and engagement. And then obviously there will be funder reports that you need to write on a regular basis. In my experience, they're mostly quarterly. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot. There's a lot of things to do depending on your project. For a planning project, you may not need to do seeker and all of that, but for a construction project, you very likely you'll be going through seeker. Another thing that I found over my time at the city of Kingston, in the beginning, we were very ambitious and we wanted to get grants. And so we would promise a lot of staff in-kind time, which sometimes you have to do to be able to meet the match of your grant. But over time, we found that documenting that time, the staff and the volunteer time, took a lot of time itself. And so if you can avoid it, I prefer cash match to a grant than in-kind staff time. I think it's better if you can fund the project and have your staff time be funded by the municipality, or it's a volunteer who's promised to do it. There's a free tool to document your staff or volunteer time. It's called Clockify. You can have multiple people on a project in that free tool. So just a suggestion. And I'm noticing that it's 11:27. Is it okay with everybody if I go a little bit over? Or
yeah,
okay.
And
It's fine.
if people need to leave, we'll understand.
Okay.
Yeah, I can stay on and then we'll continue recording. So if people have to duck out, that's fine.
Okay. Great. So managing grants, I already spoke a little bit about the reimbursement requests that you asked about earlier. There's completing the project, obviously, and then there's often, we had a joke sometimes at the City of Kingston, like, when will this project end? And sometimes closing out the project can be the most like painful part of the project, just all the details and the final reimbursement requests and making sure that the budgets align. So whenever we closed out a project, well, if it's a project that you've made happen in your community, like a rail trail or a hydro plant or something, you're obviously going to want to have a ceremony or a press release and share with your community about what you've done. But then also make sure that you take time to celebrate with your colleagues because, there are a million details in these projects that the public will never know. So when you've really closed something out, it's quite the celebration. So I'll just share about a little bit about the New York State CFAs. This is the consolidated funding application. There are many state sources that are available throughout the year, but there was an effort, I think it was in 2014 or 2015, for New York State to have all of their grant programs in one consolidated funding application. And I think the point of it was so that municipalities could put together multiple funding sources for a large project. So for many of the large projects that I worked on, we applied for 3 or 4 CFA sources, and we were able to bring together multiple funding sources. So they come out every year in May, and they're usually due at the end of July. If you're applying for many of them, it sort of makes your summer difficult. You don't get to go on vacation in July, so that's just something to keep in mind. So here I'm getting into I'm gonna sort of speed through these slides, but these are different funding sources that are available for different kinds of projects. So a general planning project, you might look at, I know one of you is interested in a comprehensive plan. You might look at the New York State Smart Growth Planning Program. And for a feasibility study, you may look into the Empire State Development. Those are generally more economic development feasibility studies. But the New York State DEC has a non-point source pollution planning program. For transportation, these are sort of sources for planning. So I know one of you is interested in a sidewalk project. You may want to start with going to your local MPO, which for us here, that's the Metropolitan Planning Organization. That's Ulster County, our Ulster County Planning Department here in my county. And you could ask them about what sort of sources do they have. They might know about something. There's other grants that you might not think of, like the New York State Department of Health has a Creating Healthy Communities grant, and you might be able to find funding through that to do a sidewalk study in your community. And then design and construction, that's, after you've done some sort of planning or engineering study. There are many funding sources. These were the typical funding sources that we would bring together for the large transportation infrastructure projects that we did in the city of Kingston. Water and sewers, there's an engineering planning program. So that might be something you look at for your hydro plant. Or any other water projects that you're looking at doing. They have an engineering planning program. I think that the EFC, it's mostly for wastewater, so it's a little bit different than maybe a hydroelectric project. But I think they have a planning grant. It's up, I think it's maybe $30,000 that you can get to have an engineer do a plan for wastewater treatment or sewer or water projects that you may want to work on. Somebody mentioned composting. I know in the city of Kingston that Julie's been working on a municipal composting program, or at least a plan. I think we got that grant through Climate Smart Communities for a composting plan, and then some other opportunities here. If you're looking for emergency funding, FEMA is a great source, although really difficult management as far as grant management goes. ARPA, which is American Rescue Plan funding, perhaps it's probably likely that your municipality has already designated how they're going to use the funds at this point, but it's something that you may want to check in with your municipal officials about. Folks talked about charging stations. There's a couple of different grants through DC and NYSERDA for charging stations. Landscape design, trees, and gardening. If anybody finds more grants on these, I'd love to hear about them, because we're looking for those for some of our RUPCO projects as well. I found this to be one of the more challenging. There are lots of grants out there for gardens. They tend to come in small amounts, like $5,000 here or there. So if you have a big project, it can be kind of challenging to pull those together. Parks and Recreation, we got a lot of funding through Office of Parks and Recreation for both rail trails and parks in Kingston. I mentioned AARP, they have a grant for helping seniors to age in place and providing recreational opportunities. So that's sort of an example of like a place that you might not expect to find an opportunity. Waterfront development, if you're on the Hudson River, there's a program through the Department of State called the LWRP, is Local Watershed. I'm blanking now. But if you look up the LWRP, they have both a planning grant and also construction funding through that program.
Revitalization.
Thank you. Yes, local waterfront revitalization program. Thank you. And then we also had grants through the Hudson River Estuary program. The Army Corps of Engineers, we started to work with them a little bit at the City of Kingston. They can be a little bit difficult to navigate, but if anybody's interested in that, I can share about my experience. And then many of these grants I didn't work with as much because Julie Noble, who I mentioned earlier, worked with these grants mostly. But there are several grants out there for energy efficiency upgrades. I know that the City of Kingston recently just installed solar panels on one of their parks buildings in Midtown Kingston. So if I know one of you mentioned that you were interested in putting them on your town hall, so I can potentially connect you with Julie about how she got that funded. Let's see, New York State Office of Parks and Recreation has a historical, they have 3 grant programs through the CFA. It's parks, heritage areas, and historic preservation. And so that's, if you're looking into historic preservation, you want to check out that grant opportunity. Also with historic preservation, there's several federal funding sources that I can share with you if you're interested in that. Housing, I'm honestly, I'm just learning about housing myself, but the main source of funding is through the New York State Homes and Community Renewal state agency, and they have a huge host of all different sorts of programs for housing. If you are interested in housing, I encourage you to contact RUPCO. It's a whole new world for me even as a grant manager at the City of Kingston. It's a challenge. The housing funding is very, very challenging. And then brownfield contamination and remediation. There's you can do a planning project through the New York State Department of State. I'm involved in one of those right now in Poughkeepsie. There's a brownfields program through EPA, which I worked on in the City of Kingston. And there's also a New York Main Street program, which RUPCO actually applied for that last year. And that can help Main Streets rehab historical structures or rehab facades or buildings on the Main Street. And then I mentioned earlier that funding staff time. You want to see if you can get your municipality to fund your staff to work on your projects. But you can also look, we've had some success in the City of Kingston with the Nova Foundation funding staff time to work on projects, and other, you never know, there might be some high net worth individual in your community that's interested in funding your project, and an easy way for them to help is to fund the person who will work on the project. So that brings me to the end, and I appreciate everybody's patience. I know I threw a lot of information at you, and I think our next steps are, if you'd like some more specific grant coaching, I'm available, and there's a request form that you would submit to Vanessa Page. And then I can also share the concept paper and the decision matrix with you to think through your project.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks, Kristen.
Bye.